Welcome to my channel, Sleep Audio Stories. Thank you for watching. Video, subscribe, and like my channel.
The Phantom Coach by Amelia B. Edwards. The circumstances I am about to relate to you have the truth to recommend them. They happened to myself, and my recollection of them is as vivid as if they had taken place only yesterday. 20 years, however, have gone by since that night. During those 20 years, I have told the story to but one other person. I tell it now with a reluctance which I find it difficult to overcome. All I entreat, meanwhile, is that you will abstain from forcing your own conclusions upon me. I want nothing explained away. I desire no arguments. My mind on this subject is quite made up, and, having the testimony of my own senses to rely upon, I prefer to abide by it. Well, it was just 20 years ago, and within a day or two of the end of the grouse season. I had been out all day with my gun, and had no sport to speak of. The wind was due east. The month? December. The place? A bleak, wide moor in the far north of England. And I had lost my way. It was not a pleasant place in which to lose one's way, with the first feathery flakes of a coming snowstorm just fluttering down upon the heather, and the leaden evening closing in all around. I shaded my eyes with my hand, and stared anxiously into the gathering darkness, where the purple moorland melted into a range of low hills, some 10 or 12 miles distant. Not the faintest smoke wreath, nor the tiniest cultivated patch, or fence, or sheep track, met my eyes in any direction. There was nothing for it but to walk on, and take my chance of finding what shelter I could by the way. So I shouldered my gun again, and pushed wearily forward, for I had been on foot since an hour after daybreak, and had eaten nothing since breakfast. Meanwhile, the snow began to come down with ominous steadiness, and the wind fell. After this, the cold became more intense, and the night came rapidly up. As for me, my prospects darkened with the darkening sky, and my heart grew heavy as I thought how my young wife was already watching for me through the window of our little inn parlor, and thought of all the suffering in store for her throughout this weary night. We had been married 4 months, and, having spent our autumn in the Highlands, were now lodging in a remote little village situated just on the verge of the great English moorlands. We were very much in love and, of course, very happy. This morning, when we parted, she had implored me to return before dusk, and I had promised her that I would. What would I not have given to have kept my word? Even now, weary as I was, I felt that with a supper, an hour's rest, and a guide, I could still get back to her before midnight, if only guide and shelter could be found. And all this time, the snow fell and the night thickened. I stopped and shouted every now and then, but my shout seemed only to make the silence deeper. Then a vague sense of uneasiness came upon me, and I began to remember stories of travelers who had walked on in the falling snow until, wearied out, they were fain to lie down and sleep their lives away. Would it be possible, I asked myself, to keep on thus through all the long dark night? Would there not come a time when my limbs must fail, and my resolution give way? When I, too, must sleep the sleep of death? Death! I shuddered. How hard to die just now, when my life lay all so bright before me. How hard for my darling, whose whole loving heart— But that thought was not to be borne. To banish it, I shouted again, louder and longer, and then listened eagerly. Was my shout answered, or did I only fancy that I heard a far-off cry? I hallooed again, and again the echo followed. Then a wavering speck of light came suddenly out of the dark, shifting, disappearing, growing momentarily nearer and brighter. Running towards it at full speed, I found myself, to my great joy, face to face with an old man and a lantern. "Thank God!" was the exclamation that burst involuntarily from my lips. Blinking and frowning, he lifted his lantern and peered into my face. "What for?" growled he, sulkily. "Well, for you. I began to fear I should be lost in the snow." Then, folks do get cast away hereabout from time to time, and what's to hinder you from being cast away likewise, if the Lord's so minded?" "If the Lord is so minded that you and I shall be lost together, friend, we must submit," I replied. "But I don't mean to be lost without you." How far are we now from Dualding? A good 20 mile, more or less. And the nearest village? The nearest village is Wyke, and that's 12 mile t'other side. Where do you live, then? Out yonder, said he, with a vague jerk of the lantern. You're going home, I presume? Maybe I am. Then I'm going with you. The old man shook his head and rubbed his nose reflectively with the handle of the lantern. It ain't of no use, growled he. He won't let you in, not he. We'll see about that, I replied briskly. Who is he? The master. Who is the master? That's not to you, was the unceremonious reply. Well, you lead the way, and I'll engage that the master shall give me shelter and supper tonight. You can try him, muttered my reluctant guide, and, still shaking his head, he hobbled, gnome-like, away through the falling snow. A large mass loomed up presently out of the darkness, and a huge dog rushed out, barking furiously. Is this the house? I asked. Aye, it's the house. Down, Bay! And he fumbled in his pocket for the key. I drew up close behind him, prepared to lose no chance of entrance, and saw in the little circle of light shed by the lantern that the door was heavily studded with iron nails, like the door of a prison. In another minute he had turned the key, and I had pushed past him into the house. Once inside, I looked round with curiosity, and found myself in a great raftered hall, which served, apparently, a variety of uses. One end was piled to the roof with corn, like a barn. The other was stored with flour sacks, agricultural implements, casks, and all kinds of miscellaneous lumber, while from the beams overhead hung rows of hams, flitches, and bunches of dried herbs for winter use. In the center of the floor stood some huge object, gauntly dressed in a dingy wrapping cloth, and reaching halfway to the rafters. Lifting a corner of this cloth, I saw, to my surprise, a telescope of very considerable size, mounted on a rude, movable platform with 4 small wheels. The tube was made of painted wood, bound round with bands of metal rudely fashioned. The speculum, so far as I could estimate its size in the dim light, measured at least 15 inches in diameter. While I was yet examining the instrument and asking myself whether it was not the work of some self-taught optician, a bell rang sharply. That's for you, said my guide, with a malicious grin. Yonder's his room. He pointed to a low black door at the opposite side of the hall. I crossed over, rapped somewhat loudly, and went in, without waiting for an invitation. A huge, white-haired old man rose from a table covered with books and papers, and confronted me sternly. Who are you? Said he. How come you here? What do you want? James Murray, barrister at law on foot across the moor, meat, drink, and sleep. He bent his bushy brows into a portentous frown. Mine is not a house of entertainment, he said haughtily. Jacob, how dared you admit this stranger? I didn't admit him, grumbled the old man. He followed me over the moor, and shouldered his way in before me. I'm no match for 6'2". And pray, sir, by what right have you forced an entrance into my house? The same by which I should have clung to your boat if I were drowning, the right of self-preservation. Self-preservation? There's an inch of snow on the ground already, I replied, briefly, and it would be deep enough to cover my body before daybreak. He strode to the window, pulled aside a heavy black curtain, and looked out. It is true, he said. You can stay, if you choose, till morning. Jacob, serve the supper. With this, he waved me to a seat, resumed his own, and became at once absorbed in the studies from which I had disturbed him. I placed my gun in a corner, drew a chair to the hearth, and examined my quarters at leisure. Smaller and less incongruous in its arrangements than the hall, this room contained, nevertheless, much to awaken my curiosity. The floor was carpetless. The whitewashed walls were in part scrawled over with strange diagrams, and in others covered with shelves crowded with philosophical instruments, the uses of many of which were unknown to me. On one side of the fireplace stood a bookcase filled with dingy folios. On the other, a small organ, fantastically decorated with painted carvings of medieval saints and devils. Through the half-open door of a cupboard at the further end of the room, I saw a long array of geological specimens, surgical preparations, crucibles, retorts, and jars of chemicals, while on the mantelpiece beside me, amid a number of small objects, stood a model of the solar system, a small galvanic battery, and a microscope. Every chair had its burden. Every corner was heaped high with books. The very floor was littered over with maps, casts, papers, tracings, and learned lumber of all conceivable kinds. I stared about me with an amazement increased by every fresh object upon which my eyes chanced to rest. So strange a room I had never seen, yet it seemed stranger still to find such a room in a lone farmhouse amid these wild and solitary moors. Over and over again, I looked from my host to his surroundings, and from his surroundings back to my host, asking myself who and what he could be. His head was singularly fine, but it was more the head of a poet than of a philosopher. Broad in the temples, prominent over the eyes, and clothed with a rough profusion of perfectly white hair, it had all the ideality and much of the ruggedness that characterizes the head of Louis von Beethoven. There were the same deep lines about the mouth, and the same stern furrows in the brow. There was the same concentration of expression. While I was yet observing him, the door opened, and Jacob brought in the supper. His master then closed his book, rose, and with more courtesy of manner than he had yet shown, invited me to the table. A dish of ham and eggs, a loaf of brown bread, and a bottle of admirable sherry were placed before me. "I have but the homeliest farmhouse fare to offer you, sir," said my entertainer. "Your appetite, I trust, will make up for the deficiencies of our larder." I had already fallen upon the viands, and now protested, with the enthusiasm of a starving sportsman, that I had never eaten anything so delicious. He bowed stiffly, and sat down to his own supper, which consisted, primitively, of a jug of milk and a basin of porridge. We ate in silence, and, when we had done, Jacob removed the tray. I then drew my chair back to the fireside. My host, somewhat to my surprise, did the same, and turning abruptly towards me said, "Sir, I have lived here in strict retirement for 23 years. During that time, I have not seen as many strange faces, and I have not read a single newspaper. You are the first stranger who has crossed my threshold for more than 4 years. Would you favor me with a few words of information respecting that outer world from which I have parted company so long?" "Pray interrogate me," I replied. "I am heartily at your service." He bent his head in acknowledgment, leaned forward, with his elbows resting on his knees, and his chin supported in the palms of his hands, stared fixedly into the fire, and proceeded to question me. His inquiries related chiefly to scientific matters, with the later progress of which, as applied to the practical purposes of life, he was almost wholly unacquainted. No student of science myself, I replied, as well as my slight information permitted, but the task was far from easy, and I was much relieved when, passing from interrogation to discussion, he began pouring forth his own conclusions upon the facts which I had been attempting to place before him. He talked, and I listened spellbound. He talked till I believe he almost forgot my presence, and only thought aloud. I had never heard anything like it then. I have never heard anything like it since. Familiar with all systems of all philosophies, subtle in analysis, bold in generalization, he poured forth his thoughts in an uninterrupted stream, and, still leaning forward in the same moody attitude with his eyes fixed upon the fire, wandered from topic to topic, from speculation to speculation, like an inspired dreamer. From practical science to mental philosophy, from electricity in the wire to electricity in the nerve, from Watts to Mesmer, from Mesmer to Reichenbach, from Reichenbach to Swedenborg, Spinoza, Condillac, Descartes, Berkeley, Aristotle, Plato, and the Magi and the mystics of the East, were transitions which, however bewildering in their variety and scope, seemed easy and harmonious upon his lips as sequences in music. By and by, I forget now by what link of conjecture or illustration, he passed on to that field which lies beyond the boundary line of even conjectural philosophy, and reaches no man knows whither. He spoke of the soul and its aspirations, of the spirit and its powers, of second sight, of prophecy, of those phenomena which, under the name of ghosts, specters, and supernatural appearances have been denied by the skeptics and attested by the credulous of all ages. The world, he said, grows hourly more and more skeptical of all that lies beyond its own narrow radius, and our men of science foster the fatal tendency. They condemn as fable all that resists experiment. They reject as false all that cannot be brought to the test of the laboratory or the dissecting room. Against what superstition have they waged so long and obstinate a war as against the belief in apparitions? And yet what superstition has maintained its hold upon the minds of men so long and so firmly? Show me any fact in physics, in history, in archaeology, which is supported by testimony so wide and so various, attested by all races of men, in all ages, in all climates, by the soberest sages of antiquity, by the rudest savage of today, by the Christian, the pagan, the pantheist, the materialist. This phenomena is treated as a nursery tale by the philosophers of our century. Circumstantial evidence weighs with them as a feather in the balance. The comparison of causes with effects, however valuable in physical science, is put aside as worthless and unreliable. The evidence of competent witnesses, however conclusive in a court of justice, counts for nothing. He who pauses before he pronounces is condemned as a trifler. He who believes is a dreamer or a fool. He spoke with bitterness, and having said thus, relapsed for some minutes into silence. Presently he raised his head from his hands, and added, with an altered voice and manner, "I, sir, paused, investigated, believed, and was not ashamed to state my convictions to the world. I, too, was branded a visionary, held up to ridicule by my contemporaries, and booted from that field of science in which I had labored with honor during all the best years of my life. These things happened just 23 years ago. Since then, I have lived as you see me living now, and the world has forgotten me, as I have forgotten the world. You have my history." "It is a very sad one," I murmured, scarcely knowing what to answer. "It is a very common one," he replied. "I have only suffered for the truth, as many a better and wiser man has suffered before me." He rose, as if desirous of ending the conversation, and went over to the window. "It has ceased snowing," he observed, as he dropped the curtain and came back to the fireside. "Ceased!" I exclaimed, starting eagerly to my feet. Oh, if it were only possible, but no, it is hopeless. Even if I could find my way across the moor, I could not walk 20 miles tonight. "Walk 20 miles tonight?" repeated my host. "What are you thinking of?" "Of my wife," I replied impatiently. "Of my young wife, who does not know that I have lost my way, and who is at this very moment breaking her heart with suspense and terror." "Where is she?" "At Dwalding, 20 miles away." "At Dwalding," he echoed thoughtfully. "Yes, the distance, it is true, is 20 miles, but are you so very anxious to save the next 6 or 8 hours?" "So very, very anxious that I would give 10 guineas at this moment for a guide and a horse." "Your wish can be gratified at a less costly rate," said he, smiling. "The night mail from the north, which changes horses at Dwalding, passes within 5 miles of this spot, and will be due at a certain crossroad in about an hour and a quarter. If Jacob were to go with you across the moor and put you into the old coach road, you could find your way, I suppose, to where it joins the new one?" "Easily, gladly." He smiled again, rang the bell, gave the old servant his directions, and, taking a bottle of whiskey and a wine-glass from the cupboard in which he kept his chemicals, said, "The snow lies deep, and it will be difficult walking tonight on the moor. A glass of usqueban before you start?" I would have declined the spirit, but he pressed it on me, and I drank it. It went down my throat like liquid flame, and almost took my breath away. "It is strong," he said, but it will help to keep out the cold. And now you have no moments to spare. Good night." I thanked him for his hospitality and would have shaken hands, but that he had turned away before I could finish my sentence. In another minute, I had traversed the hall, Jacob had locked the outer door behind me, and we were out on the wide, white moor. Although the wind had fallen, it was still bitterly cold. Not a star glimmered in the black vault overhead. Not a sound, save the rapid crunching of the snow beneath our feet, disturbed the heavy stillness of the night. Jacob, not too well pleased with his mission, shambled on before in sullen silence, his lantern in his hand, and his shadow at his feet. I followed with my gun over my shoulder, as little inclined for conversation as himself. My thoughts were full of my late host. His voice yet rang in my ears. His eloquence yet held my imagination captive. I remember to this day, with surprise, how my overexcited brain retained whole sentences and parts of sentences, troops of brilliant images, and fragments of splendid reasoning, in the very words in which he had uttered them. Musing thus over what I had heard, and striving to recall a lost link here and there, I strode on the heels of my guide, absorbed and unobservant. Presently, at the end, as it seemed to me, of only a few minutes, he came to a sudden halt, and said, "Yon's your road. Keep the stone fence to your right hand, and you can't be fail of the way." "This, then, is the old coach road?" "Aye, 'tis the old coach road." "And how far do I go before I reach the crossroads?" "Nigh upon 3 mile." I pulled out my purse, and he became more communicative. "The road's a fair road ahead," said he, "for foot passengers, but 'twas over steep and narrow for the northern traffic. You'll mind where the parapet's broken away, close again to the signpost. It's never been mended since the accident." "What accident?" The night mail pitched right over into the valley below, a good 50 feet and more, just at the worst bit of road in the whole country." "Horrible! Were many lives lost?" "All. 4 were found dead, and t'other 2 died next morning." "How long is it since this happened?" "Just 9 year." "Near the signpost, you say? I will bear it in mind. Good night." "Good night, sir, and thank ye." Jacob pocketed his half-crown, made a faint pretense of touching his hat, and trudged back the way he had come. I watched the light of his lantern till it quite disappeared, and then turned to pursue my way alone. This was no longer matter of the slightest difficulty, for, despite the dead darkness overhead, the line of stone fence showed distinctly enough against the pale gleam of the snow. How silent it seemed now, with only my footsteps to listen to. How silent, and how solitary. A strange, disagreeable sense of loneliness stole over me. I walked faster. I hummed a fragment of a tune. I cast up enormous sums in my head, and accumulated them at compound interest. I did my best, in short, to forget the startling speculations to which I had but just been listening, and, to some extent, I succeeded. Meanwhile, the night air seemed to become colder and colder, and though I walked fast, I found it impossible to keep myself warm. My feet were like ice. I lost sensation in my hands, and grasped my gun mechanically. I even breathed with difficulty, as though, instead of traversing a quiet north country highway, I were scaling the uppermost heights of some gigantic Alp. This last symptom became presently so distressing that I was forced to stop for a few minutes, and lean against the stone fence. As I did so, I chanced to look back up the road, and there, to my infinite relief, I saw a distant point of light, like the gleam of an approaching lantern. I at first concluded that Jacob had retraced his steps and followed me, but even as the conjecture presented itself, a second light flashed into sight, a light evidently parallel to the first, and approaching at the same rate of motion. It needed no second thought to show me that these must be the carriage lamps of some private vehicle, though it seemed strange that any private vehicle should take a road professionally disused and dangerous. There could be no doubt, however, of the fact, for the lamps grew larger and brighter every moment, and I even fancied I could already see the dark outline of the carriage behind them. It was coming up very fast, and quite noiselessly, the snow being nearly a foot deep under the wheels. And now the body of the vehicle became distinctly visible behind the lamps. It looked strangely lofty. A sudden suspicion flashed upon me. Was it possible that I had passed the crossroads in the dark without observing the signpost? And could this be the very coach which I had come to meet? No need to ask myself that question a second time, for here it came round the bend of the road, guard and driver, one outside passenger, and 4 steaming greys, all wrapped in a soft haze of light, through which the lamps blazed out like a pair of fiery meteors. I jumped forward, waved my hat, and shouted. The mail came down at full speed and passed me. For a moment I feared that I had not been seen or heard, but it was only for a moment. The coachman pulled up. The guard, muffled to the eyes in capes and comforters, and apparently sound asleep in the rumble, neither answered my hail nor made the slightest effort to dismount. The outside passenger did not even turn his head. I opened the door for myself, and looked in. There were but 3 travelers inside, so I stepped in, shut the door, slipped into the vacant corner, and congratulated myself on my good fortune. The atmosphere of the coach seemed, if possible, colder than that of the outer air, and was pervaded by a singularly damp and disagreeable smell. I looked round at my fellow passengers. They were all 3 men, and all silent. They did not seem to be asleep, but each leaned back in his corner of the vehicle, as if absorbed in his own reflections. I attempted to open a conversation. "How intensely cold it is tonight," I said, addressing my opposite neighbor. He lifted his head, looked at me, but made no reply. "The winter," I added, "seems to have begun in earnest." Although the corner in which he sat was so dim that I could distinguish none of his features very clearly, I saw that his eyes were still turned full upon me, and yet he answered never a word. At any other moment I should have felt, and perhaps expressed, some annoyance, but at the moment I felt too ill to do either. The icy coldness of the night air had struck a chill to my very marrow, and the strange smell inside the coach was affecting me with an intolerable nausea. I shivered from head to foot, and, turning to my left-hand neighbor, asked if he had any objection to an open window. He neither spoke nor stirred. I repeated the question, somewhat more loudly, but with the same result. Then I lost patience and let the sash down. As I did so, the leather strap broke in my hand, and I observed that the glass was covered with a thick coat of mildew, the accumulation, apparently, of years. My attention being thus drawn to the condition of the coach, I examined it more narrowly, and saw by the uncertain light of the outer lamps that it was in the last stage of dilapidation. Every part of it was not only out of repair, but in a condition of decay. The sashes splintered at a touch. The leather fittings were crusted over with mold, and literally rotting from the woodwork. The floor was almost breaking away beneath my feet. The whole machine, in short, was foul with damp, and had evidently been dragged from some outhouse in which it had been mouldering away for years, to do another day or 2 of duty on the road. I turned to the 3rd passenger, whom I had not yet addressed, and hazarded one more remark. "This coach," I said, "is in a deplorable condition. The regular mail, I suppose, is under repair?" He moved his head slowly and looked me in the face, without speaking a word. I shall never forget that look while I live. I turned cold at heart under it. I turn cold at heart even now when I recall it. His eyes glowed with a fiery, unnatural luster. His face was livid as the face of a corpse. His bloodless lips were drawn back as if in the agony of death, and showed the gleaming teeth beneath. The words that I was about to utter died upon my lips, and a strange horror, a dreadful horror, came upon me. My sight had by this time become used to the gloom of the coach, and I could see with tolerable distinctness. I turned to my opposite neighbor. He, too, was looking at me, with the same startling pallor in his face, and the same stony glimmer in his eyes. I passed my hand across my brow. I turned to the passenger on the seat beside my own, and saw, oh heaven! How shall I describe what I saw? I saw that he was no living man, that none of them were living men like myself. A pale phosphorescent light, the light of putrefaction, played upon their awful faces, upon their hair, dank with the dews of the grave, upon their clothes, earth-stained and dropping into pieces, upon their hands, which were as the hands of corpses long buried. Only their eyes, their terrible eyes, were living, and those eyes were all turned menacingly upon me. A shriek of terror, a wild, unintelligible cry for help and mercy, burst from my lips as I flung myself against the door and strove in vain to open it. In that single instant, brief and vivid as a landscape beheld in the flash of summer lightning, I saw the moon shining down through a rift of stormy cloud, the ghastly signpost rearing its warning finger by the wayside, the broken parapet, the plunging horses, the black gulf below. Then the coach reeled like a ship at sea. Then came a mighty crash, a sense of crushing pain, and then darkness. It seemed as if years had gone by when I awoke one morning from a deep sleep and found my wife watching by my bedside. I will pass over the scene that ensued and give you, in half a dozen words, the tale she told me with tears of thanksgiving. I had fallen over a precipice, close against the junction of the old coach road and the new, and had only been saved from certain death by lighting upon a deep snowdrift that had accumulated at the foot of the rock beneath. In this snowdrift I was discovered at daybreak by a couple of shepherds, who carried me to the nearest shelter and brought a surgeon to my aid. The surgeon found me in a state of raving delirium, with a broken arm and a compound fracture of the skull. The letters in my pocketbook showed my name and address. My wife was summoned to nurse me, and, thanks to youth and a fine constitution, I came out of danger at last. The place of my fall, I need scarcely say, was precisely that at which a frightful accident had happened to the North Mail 9 years before. I never told my wife the fearful events which I have just related to you. I told the surgeon who attended me, but he treated the whole adventure as a mere dream born of the fever in my brain. We discussed the question over and over again, until we found that we could discuss it with temper no longer, and then we dropped it. Others may form what conclusions they please. I know that 20 years ago, I was the fourth inside passenger in that phantom coach.
The Young Man Who Wanted to Die by Anonymous. First episode. In a mean, miserable $2 a week bedroom in a Chicago lodging house, a young man was calmly and deliberately preparing to kill himself. He possessed youth, health, affluence, and comeliness, and yet he was preparing to kill himself, calmly and deliberately, in the shabby room of a shabby hovel. With a penknife, he was ripping the bedclothes to ribbons and wedging them into chinks and crannies. At last satisfied that the room was as near gas-tight as he could make it, he stripped to his underclothing and sat down at the battered bureau and began to write. As soon as my dead body is found, the newspapers will want to know why I did it. I'll tell them, and they may scarehead it as much as they like. I don't care. I've destroyed every clue to my identity, and though I'm wealthy enough to be pointed to and stared at, there's not one in this vast city whom I know. Not one who cares whether I am alive tomorrow morning or dead. A love motive? Yes. But there is also something else. Something equally potent to me, however weak and flimsy it may appear to others. I loved, and do still love, a girl whom I have known from childhood, but always there has been this thing that stood between us, and which is chiefly accountable for what I'm about to do. It is not drink, nor gambling, nor hereditary disease. It is a curiosity, an awful, overwhelming, unconquerable curiosity. As far back as I can remember, I've had a terrible desire to know what follows death. As I grew up, this craving increased until it was a positive mania. I devoured every book on theosophy and kindred subjects I could lay hands on. I attended meetings of psychic societies. At college, my avidity for psychology was remarked by everybody. At length I had reached the point where I yearned to tear aside the black veil of death and discover her secret. Why wait? I asked myself. Since you are so bound to go someday, why not go now? One day I half playfully voiced some such sentiment to her. It led to a dispute, which led to a violent quarrel, and that night she left the town where we both lived. I traced her as far as Chicago, and here I have lost her. For 3 years now I have searched the city for her, but not a trace have I found. And so I have given it up. It is hopeless. I shall never see her again. Like myself, she is alone in the world, but unlike me, she is very poor, and somewhere in this great, monstrous city she is living even as I write these words, perhaps miles away, perhaps in the next block, perhaps. God alone knows, and God protect her. He stopped, put down his pencil, and placed his hand before his eyes. Thus he sat for several minutes. The yellow gas flames flickered weirdly at either side of the shabby bureau. The clangor of a distant streetcar reached him faintly. A motor truck rambled heavily in the street below. A bickering couple jawed and wrangled ceaselessly in the next room. After a while, he picked up the pencil and went on. Well, anyway, I'm going to gratify that curiosity. In a few hours, I shall be in an unknown country I have always longed to explore. I've an idea I'll find a happiness there I have never known on this earth. In any event, I shall leave some good front-page stuff for the newspapers. It ought to make an interesting story. Rich young man seeking his lost sweetheart in the great city gives way to despair and kills himself. If the girl is found next door without money to buy food or pay her room rent. He rose abruptly with a sharp curse and tore up what he had written. Then he turned off both gas jets, then turned them on full, and then lay down upon the cot in a corner of the room. It was perhaps some 20 minutes before his body began to twitch convulsively. Lily May, he murmured huskily, then more hoarsely still. Lily May, forgive, Lily May. His body was writhing and twisting horribly now. His hands were clutching at the air, at his clothing, at the mattress. His legs were contracting and relaxing spasmodically. His face turned purple. He choked and gasped. Lily May, he cried in a stifling whisper, and attempted to lift his arms. But he could not, and his lips ceased moving, and his head fell back, and he lay very still. Second episode. When the deadly gas fumes reached the youth on the cot, he turned over on his back, threw his arms out, and breathed long and deeply of the poisoned air. His head throbbed and pounded, his heart pumped madly, his eyes stared from their sockets. Yet still he lay with outstretched arms, inhaling evenly and steadily. Then everything within him seemed to warp and become distorted and askew. His veins tied themselves in knots, his blood choked and clogged. An awful weight crushed and crunched his breast. But he set his teeth and clenched his fists and continued to gulp in the murderous air. Then he felt himself dropping, gently, gently, down, 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 as though invisible hands were lowering him into some bottomless, pitch-black cavern. But suddenly there burst upon his vision a dazzling, golden light, and far above him he saw a blazing throne, sparkling and flashing with a strange brilliancy, and on the throne a girl, her hair undone, her body clothed in a virginal robe. And as she gazed down upon him with eyes full of sadness and reproach, and he tried to call out to her, and he tried to lift his arms to her, and the fiendish darkness swept all away and closed in upon him and crushed him, and he knew no more. Third episode. Eons of time had passed. All was in impenetrable blackness. With incredible velocity, he was whizzing through infinite space. Nothing supported him. Nothing touched him. Some unseen, unfelt, unthinkable force was hurtling him outward into the Stygian, unbounded void. Then, so gradually that it was scarcely perceptible, the blackness was dyed a pallid, ghastly hue. And with a shocking suddenness, it became alive with a horrible larvae. Bloodless and transparent things they seemed, filling the air with a swarming, wriggling magnitude of loathsome life. And he was a part of this. He put out his hand, and though he felt no touch, he saw the squirming mass of worms pass through his flesh as though nothing were there. And he knew his body swarmed with them, as though it were decayed cheese, and an unspeakable, revolting nausea surged through him. Then the paleness vanished, and the larvae with it, and he was still shooting through the horrible darkness. Another eon had passed, nor had his terrible flight abated. Outward through unlightened infinitude he swept untiringly. Unearthly sounds now filled the air, voices screaming in agony, cries and moans as of tortured souls, insane laughter and maniacal shrieks. Anon, with a howl and a hiss, some shrieking air dragon would roar past him, and all around he could hear the bellow and screech of monsters of the air in terrible conflict. Then all turned to an ocean of living blood, and great crimson bellows belched over him, wave upon horrid wave, and the frightful aerial mammals, invisible a moment before, were now seen leaping and plunging through that scarlet sea. Under him and over him they ducked and bounded, gigantic green-hued monsters extravagantly hideous. Now and again one would dart for him, mouth distended, but the next second he would be far away with the ghastly creature in hopeless pursuit. Slowly the liquid redness merged into a shimmering rainbow of vivid colors. Yellow and green and purple and blue and orange streaked the air with a prismatic glory, glittering and scintillating with a marvelous beauty. Then, with a terrific suddenness, like a noiseless thunderclap, the blackness rushed in and blotted out the dazzling iridescence and cloaked all in Cimmerian darkness. 4th episode. Another eon. So far away it seemed a distant star. The lone traveler through the infinite void discerned a dull red glow. Larger and larger it grew as he soared toward it with lightning velocity. And now it seemed a great mass of flameless fire, shedding its cold rays for millions of miles. With every second it grew in size until it was come to inconceivable proportion. And then it seemed to shrivel up and turn ashen and wrinkled, and become as a dead and crumbling sun. But suddenly the husk burst open, and the wayfarer described dimly at first what seemed the outermost rim of some gorgeous primeval world. A while it was, as though he were watching it from afar off. But he traversed thousands of leagues in as many seconds, and swiftly it took definite shape as he flew nearer and yet nearer. And then his journey through illimitable space was at an end, and he had alighted upon this unknown world, and was wandering through a dense jungle of some marvelous fungus that attained a wondrous height. Seemingly without his own volition, he at length found himself lying on a verdant mound overlooking a vast tropical morass that reached off on all sides into endless vista. And while he lay there, he witnessed in that untracked wilderness a diabolical spectacle appalling as hell itself. Grisly, indescribable things, satyrs and ogres and demons and fiends appeared in countless numbers and held orgies that were madness intensified. Now they were reveling and cavorting in wanton abandon, anon battling among themselves in murderous ferocity. After a time, he viewed a sight still more horrible. Off to the right, he saw a monstrous snake's head, as huge as the body of a hippopotamus, rise up from the swamp and gaze on ravenously at the riotous revel. An instant later, the licentious carousel was become wildest terror. The forest was alive with frightful reptiles, gigantic, stupendous things that passed the extent of all imagination. Down they swooped upon their terrified prey, their enormous, slippery bodies undulating in great, writhing leaps. The horde of unearthly things disporting in hellish debauchery a moment before were swiftly swallowed up by the serpents. Left in possession of the swamp, they flopped about venomously for a time, demolishing and laying waste all about them. Then they fell upon one another in unspeakable combat, wriggling and squirming slimily together, their repulsive green-black lengths intertwined like enormous angleworms. And they killed and devoured each other, until at last there was left but one hideous, swollen monster. It leaped and dashed about, lashing its great tail furiously, tearing down giant trees as though they were weeds. And as the young man watched, the incredible thing seemed to swell larger and larger. And then he saw it stop suddenly in its bromdignation gambol and rigidly poise its hideous head. And he looked straight into its horrifying eyes. They were fixed steadily upon him. But a moment it stayed thus, then its head dropped, and he saw its mammoth body undulating swiftly toward him through the swamp. He strove to cry out, but could utter no sound. He tried to move, but his body was as lead. On came the thing with frightful rapidity, parts of its writhing length now sinking into the quagmire, now towering high above it. Now he could see that massive head swinging from side to side. Now only a dark, slimy greenish mass, describing an arc over the swamp, showed its location. Now it was close upon him. Its vast head swooped up a scant distance away. Its fulsome eyes blazed upon him with a furious fire. Its great, drooping jaws swung open. They bristled with venomous fangs. The monster gathered itself in a dozen gigantic coils and leapt through the air. "God!" he shrieked. "There, there," soothed the tender voice. "Don't excite yourself. You'll be all right presently. Just remain quiet, that's all." A cool hand was laid gently upon his brow. He looked up at the young nurse who sat beside his cot. Without saying a word, he stared for quite a long time at her face, until her cheeks were as crimson as the ribbon at her throat. When at length he spoke, he was half laughing, half sobbing, and the syntax of his utterance would scarcely have delighted a professor of English at Harvard University. "Well, I've been, girl," said he. "Got a round ticket, but never, never again. What'd you run away for? Yep, I've had my fill, no more metaphysics. Phew! Such reptiles, big as this room, some of them. I looked 3 years and it ran me crazy. Ugh, those snakes and lizards. Hired detectives too, but it was no use. And I thought it was all sunshine and flowers and sweet music. You won't run away again, will you? Could you get me a little brandy, Lily May? I'm feeling a bit faint." Last episode. The young man made a mistake about the newspapers. 1 inch was all he got, tucked snugly between a patent medicine advertisement and the notice of a sheriff's sale. It read, "An unidentified youth attempted to take his life in a North Side rooming house last night by inhaling gas. The landlady smelled the odor of gas and called the police. Miss Lily May Kettering, a nurse at the National Emergency Hospital who seems to know the young man, although refusing to divulge his identity, reports that he's on the road to recovery."
Bells of Oceana by Arthur J. Burks. It was on a heavily laden troop ship westward heading, hours before the sun had gone down toward China, trailing ebon night behind her. For a full week since dropping the California coast behind us, there had been nothing in all the wild waste of waters for us to see, save ourselves. No ship's funnels broke the lowering horizon, no sign of land, for our skipper had chosen a passage lying somewhere in between the usual steamer lanes. The nearest land, save that which stretched in eternal darkness some 3 miles below us, was more than 1,000 miles beyond the southern horizon. We were just a single ship, burdened with a precious freight of souls upon an ocean that seemed endless. The first day out had been squally, and everyone had been sick, save those of us who had gone down to the sea in ships before. But with the dawning of the second morning, the sea had calmed down, and our vessel rode through the blue toward the horizon bowl which ever crept before us in the golden wake of the setting sun. The voyage, if the old salts spoke truly, would be uneventful, but with that strange premonitory feeling which comes to all of us at times, I did not believe them. Something, from the very first, warned me that our voyage was ill-fated. I couldn't explain my feeling. It wasn't a feeling of dread exactly, nor of fear. Just a strange feeling of unease, much like that which comes to people on their first voyage, when a ship is rolling slightly under their feet, and everything, until they get their sea legs, seems strangely out of focus. That doesn't explain it, I know, but it is as near as I can put my feeling into words. I knew when the sun went down ahead of us, with the 180th meridian less than 24 hours ahead, that we were on the eve of strange, momentous happenings. To add to my feeling of unease, and as though it had been all planned out by some invisible something or somebody in the vague beginning, the officer who should have had the watch that night fell suddenly ill, and I was called upon to take his place. I knew as I donned my belt holster and pistol that I but obeyed the will of some invisible prompter, a prompter without a name. We had 7 sentries out at various important places about the ship, and I made the routine inspections before turning in, less than an hour before midnight. When I entered my stateroom and turned on the light, that feeling of unease was more pronounced than it had been at any time previously. I had the feeling, though I had locked my door when I had last quitted my stateroom, that I had entered again immediately after someone had left it. Yet, that was impossible. I had carried the key in my pocket all the time, and my cabin boy was not provided with one. There was no way that anyone or anything could have entered my stateroom in my absence, save. Still, as though my every move had been ordered by some invisible prompter, my eyes darted to the porthole beside my bed. It was quite too small for the passage of a human body, and even to think of such a thing were the utmost folly. If anyone had gone out through the porthole, that one had fallen or plunged into the sea, for had the porthole been ever so big, there was absolutely no way one could have left my stateroom by that way and still remained upon the ship, unless that one had gone out and were even now hanging by his hands along the ship's side. So strongly had the feeling of an alien presence obtruded itself upon me that, in spite of knowing myself an utter fool for entertaining any doubt whatsoever, I strode to the porthole and looked out. There was nothing, of course, save water, now black and forbidding, stretching away to the south to a horizon that, since night had fallen, seemed to have crept quite close to us to watch our passing. Still unsatisfied, in spite of arguing with myself, condemning myself for a fool, I deliberately closed the glass which masked the port, took my seat in a chair beside the bunk, facing the round glass, which resembled to an imagination suddenly fevered the eye of a huge one-eyed giant, the porthole, and began to undress. Mechanically, I lifted first one foot and then the other, removing shoes and stockings. But I kept my eyes upon the closed porthole, and that feeling of an unseen presence in the room was stronger as the moments fled. My undressing completed, I stood erect to turn out the lights and paused in the very act, a cry of terror smothered in my throat by a sheer act of will. For the most fleeting of seconds, I had seen a dead white face outside the glass which covered the porthole. It was the face of a person who had drowned, I told myself wildly, and the dripping hair wore a coronet of fluttering seaweed. The eyes of this strange outsider stared straight into mine, devoid of expression, totally unwinking, and the lips, which seemed blue as though with icy cold, long endured, smiled a thin and ironic smile. It took all the courage I possessed, which is little enough in the face of the unknown, to hurl myself across the bed, right hand extended toward the heavy screw which held the circular piece of glass in place. In the instant my hand would have touched the glass, the ship rode into the edge of the storm that was to fill the remainder of the night, and the stern of the steamer rose dizzily on the crest of a mighty wave, dragging all the vessel with it, and the face slid slowly out of sight below the porthole, the bluish lips still smiling ironically. I admit that I was trembling, that my fingers were unsteady as I fumbled with the screw to unloose the glass. When the porthole was open once more, and the cold breeze of this latitude came in to fan my fevered face, I thrust my head out of the port and gazed right and left and up and down along the curving side of the ship. But there was nothing save straight ahead on our port side, and even there was nothing but black water, huge mountainous waves touched with whitecaps at their crests, like flying shrouds or like lacy streamers created as a fringe for the mantle of night. I watched several of the waves sweep under the vessel, which rose and fell sluggishly. The waves seemed to be traveling in no certain direction, but broke into a veritable welter of warring forces, roaring as they came together with the roaring of maddened, deep-throated bulls. Valleys with darkness on their floors, mountain-tops touched with snow that shifted eerily in the breeze. I was about to close the port when, many yards away from the ship, as though born of the womb of old ocean, I heard the bells. Like the tiny bells which the bellwether wears to signal the ewes and the lambs, was the tinkling of the bells. Like those bells, yet not like them, totally out of place in mid-ocean, and I felt a strange prickling of the scalp as I listened. Hurriedly driven by fear I could not have explained then, nor can I now explain, I closed the porthole again, and whirled about with another scream, which this time came forth from my quivering lips in spite of all I could do to prevent. Just inside my stateroom door stood my sergeant of the guard, and his lips were trembling more wildly than my own. His eyes protruded horribly, his face was chalk white, and he was striving with all his power to speak. As I watched his manful struggle, I dreaded for him to speak, for I knew that what he had come to tell me would be something strange and terrible, something hitherto entirely outside my experience. "Sir," he managed at last, when I stiffly nodded permission for him to speak, "I just made the rounds of the sentries." Here the poor fellow stopped, unable to go on, and his knees knocked together audibly. "Yes, Sergeant," I managed to mutter. "You went the usual rounds of the sentries, and then?" "The sentry who should be on duty on the main deck, forward of the bridge, is missing." Of course I knew on the instant that there might be many reasons for the failure of the sergeant of the guard to find the sentry, many logical reasons. The sentry might have quitted his post, a violation of regulations, true, for a quiet cigarette in the lee of a lifeboat. He might have been walking his post in the direction taken by the sergeant so that the latter had not overtaken him, even with a complete circling of the main deck. He might... Oh, there were many logical explanations, but I guess instinctively that none of these reasons fitted the case. For one thing, the sergeant of the guard was an old-timer, had spent many years of his life at sea, yet he was frightened half out of his wits, and I knew he held as many decorations for bravery as any other officer or man in the Marine Corps. There was something terrible, something, if you will, uncanny, behind this disappearance of the sentry. I muttered an oath more to prod my own flagging courage than for any other reason, and started toward the door, motioning the sergeant to precede me, but he shook his head stubbornly and barred my way. I halted, for it was evident that he had not completed his report. "You'll maybe think me daft," he said, "but I couldn't let you go out there, sir, without telling you everything. The corporal on watch at the head of the promenade gangway told me a strange story just before I made my rounds. He opened the door leading onto the starboard promenade for a look at the weather outside, and just as he was about to close it again, the ship lifted on the crest of a huge wave. And out beyond the wave, many yards away from the ship, he heard something which he likened to the tinkling of little bells. "Good God!" I exclaimed. "And," the sergeant continued, "all the time I was looking for the missing sentry, I had the idea there was someone behind me, following me every step of the way. Yet when I whirled to look, the deck behind me was empty." "And you found no sign of the sentry?" I said stupidly. The sergeant shook his head. "Nothing," he said, except, well, sir, you'll maybe think me daft as I said before, but on the spot where the sentry had stood to wait for me on my last round, I found wet marks on the deck floor. The marks, as near as I could tell with my flashlight, of bare feet." Mechanically, as the sergeant spoke, I had been donning my clothes, leaving my shoes, however, unlaced. I felt an icy chill along my spine as the sergeant continued, and I dreaded, as I'd never dreaded anything before, to ask him further about those wet footprints on the deck. "The wet footprints," he went on, and he was talking wildly now, his words tripping over one another. So rapidly were they uttered, as though he wished to finish his report before I could interrupt again. "Led away where the sentry should have been standing straight to the starboard rail. Right at the rail I stooped to examine the prints more closely. They were the footprints of a human being, I was sure, and the marks of the toes were blurred, and very wide, as though whoever, or whatever, had made them had been carrying a burden in his arms." "Good God, Sergeant!" I said again. "What are you driving at?" "Just this, sir. There's something terribly wrong with this ship. Something took that sentry bodily over the side." I believe that putting a name, however meaningless, to what was in my own mind caused a little of my courage to return, for I did not find it difficult now to bring myself to leave the stateroom. The sergeant almost trod on my heels as I hurried to the main deck, starboard side, where the wind wrapped icy fingers around me, chilling me to the bone on the instant. As I hurried forward, I looked over the side, into the welter of waters, and stopped short. Behind me the sergeant groaned, hollowly, like a man who has been mortally wounded, for out of the waters away to starboard came the sound of tinkling bells. I darted to the rail and leaned far outboard, striving to pierce the gloom. But there was nothing save the watery wastes, mountains, and valleys, and two spots of greenish phosphorescence far out like serpents' eyes which watched the passing ship. But when I looked at them closely, straining my eyes, seeking the form below the eyes, the twin balls of eerie flame vanished, a wall of water obtruding itself between. Well, we found the sentry, sprawled on his face where the sergeant should have found him on his rounds. I turned the body over, and it was quite cold, with excellent reason. The corpse was dripping wet, entirely nude, and the lips and cheeks as coldly blue as though the corpse had been dragged for hours on a line in the wake of the ship. No matter how secluded one's life may have been, no matter how carefully one may have been guarded during one's lifetime, there come into the lives of most of us certain inexplicable happenings which may never be forgotten. This matter of the dead sentry was one of these for me, and I shall go to my grave with the memory of his cold cheeks and bluish lips limned upon the retina of my very soul. So many strange circumstances. Thank God that at the moment I could not look into the 2 hours or more of terror which even then stretched before me, else I should most surely have gone entirely mad. Were there connected with this matter that, taken all together, it is little wonder that I have been unable to forget, or ever shall forget. The roaring of the wind, which was lashing all the ocean into fury, a maelstrom in mid-ocean, ghostly white caps stretching away into darkness, into seeming infinity. The frightened sergeant behind me, his teeth chattering with fear. The dead sentry at my feet, his body blue with cold, entirely nude, as I have said. The marks on the deck of huge, bare feet, wet as though the feet had come up out of the sea. The eerie sound of bells between our vessel and the lowering horizon. and that dead white face which I had seen beyond the porthole of my own cabin a half-hour before. What was the explanation of it all? What was the cause of the bells, if bells there were? What had come up out of the sea to stride barefooted across the promenade deck of the slumbering troop ship? Had my sentry seen whatever had come for him before he had been taken? Add to all these circumstances the fact that all hell was loose in the watery wastes, that it was now after midnight, and you will understand a little of my feelings. Never before or since have I been as frightened as I was then. I don't regard myself as a coward, nor am I ordinarily superstitious. But show me the man who is without fear in the presence of the unknown, the utter uncanny, and I will show you a man who has no soul. I whirled, bumping into the sergeant, who manfully muffled a scream at my unexpected movement, and started, almost blindly, toward the stern of the troop ship. As I strode along with the sergeant at my heels once more, strange images fled across my mind. I remembered the tale of Die Lorelei, the maiden who lured sailors to their death with her eerie singing, and strained my eyes through the gloom, seeking shapes I feared to see. Then my mind went further back, to the years before I could read, years in which, thirsty for knowledge, I studied pictures out of old histories to satisfy my longings for wisdom. One of these pictures came back to my mind as I hurried aft, a picture of a hideous monster of unbelievable proportions who had come up from behind the ocean's horizon, blotting out the sunlight, long arms extended into the picture's foreground, the right hand holding aloft a medieval sailing vessel which had been lifted bodily from the ocean. A fantastic picture, I knew now, drawn to prove the existence of terrible monsters beyond the horizon, to which as yet no caravel or galleon had dared travel. I wondered as I strode aft why this old picture should return to my mind at this time, and fear was at my throat again as I walked. "I am coming, oh my beloved!" The words, high-pitched with ecstasy, came from straight ahead of me, and out of the heavy shadow cast by a huge funnel stepped one of my sentries. Just for a second, as he strode toward the starboard rail, I could see his face, and the face was transfigured, as though the man gazed into the very soul of the perfect sweetheart somewhere beyond the rail. Slowly, step by step, as though he would prolong the joy of anticipation, the sentry, who had hurled his rifle aside, approached the rail, still with his eyes fixed on the welter of waters overside, while I halted spellbound to watch what he would do. From out of the waters there came once more the tinkling of bells, and with the sound, as though the sound had been a signal, a huge shadow detached itself from the shadow whence the sentry had stepped but a moment ago, and loomed high above the luckless youth. At the same time the ship climbed high upon a monster wave, so that her starboard side went down, down, until white water came over the side, and when she straightened again, shuddering through all of her, the sentry had vanished. From well rearward of where the man had disappeared, from out of the smother of waters, there came a single, long-drawn cry. And it was not a cry of terror, not a cry of pain, but a scream of ecstasy. "He's gone, Sergeant," I said stupidly. But what took him? Not the wave. He had but to seize the rail to save himself. "Did you see the shadow, Lieutenant?" the sergeant replied. I did not answer. He knew I had seen it. We strode on again, heading toward the stern of the ship, and all about us now over the ship, on either side of her, but never on her, there tinkled the eerie, unexplainable bells. We stood at last in the very stern of the troop ship, gazing into the ghostly wake, far below our coign of vantage, and with certain care I followed the wake rearward with my eyes. But one could not follow it far. That was the circumstance which impressed itself upon me almost at once. The wake died away, short off, within less than a dozen yards of the ship's stern, as though at the very moment of birth it had been ignominiously smothered. In a trice I understood the reason. and thought I understood many things besides. For like a monster raft, stretching away rearward as far as I could see, and into the darkness beyond my vision to right and left, there followed us close to an undulating mass of odorless seaweed. Acres and acres of it there were, rising and falling sluggishly, but keeping pace with the troop ship through the night and the storm. Came again that sound of bells, and my hair stiffened at the base of my skull when I saw, watching the seaweed, the result of the tinkling of the bells. The seaweed, when the bells sounded, seemed imbued suddenly with life that was utterly and completely rampant. Long tendrils of the stuff drew away to right and left below us, as though endowed with will of their own, and these tendrils, countless thousands of them, collided with other tendrils in the mass, and slithered over them, so that all the mass of the seaweed writhed as though in torment, resembling countless hordes of serpents gathered together from all the evil places of the earth. And where the tendrils had drawn aside, I could see black water in the rift, as though the tendrils had drawn aside so that I might see. Some terrible fascination held me, my eyes fixed on that space of black water. For several moments after the tendrils of seaweed had drawn away to the right and left, and up from the depths into the opening came two who filled all my being with abject terror, and something else. One of the two was dead. I knew on the instant, for I could see his face all white and drawn, yet with the blue lips smiling, of the ill-fated sentry who had gone over the side before my very eyes. And he had been brought up from the depths in the arms of... I hesitate to give the creature a name. A woman? I scarcely know. Yet this I do know. In the instant I looked into her eyes, raised to mine for a full minute, I understood the ecstasy which I had read in the face of the sentry, whom she now held in her arms. Her breasts, nude and unashamed, were the breasts of a buxom woman, her lips as red as full-blown roses, her hair as black as the wings of a crow, a mantle of loveliness all about her wondrous body, whipping this way and that in the storm. Her eyes swerved away from mine, and one arm, shapely and snowy, raised aloft from the water, and to my ears came again the sound of tinkling bells. Once more the seaweed writhed and twisted, pressed forward about the ship, but a single mass of it detached itself from the larger mass, pressed close to the, should I call her woman, and swerved away again, and the arms of the beautiful creature were empty. Instinctively I whirled about, knowing somehow that I must move my head before I met this creature's eyes again, and stared forward to the shadowy portion of the promenade whence the sentry had emerged before his plunge over the side. Up the starboard side of the ship crept a veritable wall of seaweed, up the rail, pausing there for a moment, then to the deck, where it writhed for a moment or two, taking a weird, distorted shape that made me think of a man, yet which I knew was not a man, before it strode into the center of the promenade. From out of the heart of this monstrosity there dropped soggily a white, cold figure. The second sentry had returned, as the first had done. Why? 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 What did all this unbelievable terror mean? I knew as I searched through all my experience, seeking the key to this uncanny enigma, that we were heading westward outside the usually traveled sea lanes. That ships seldom, if ever, came this way. That in 7 days we had seen not one vessel, nor even the smoke of one upon the horizon. Why did not vessels come this way? But I could not answer my many questions. I could only ask them and hope within me that they be not answered, ever. Nauseated by the return of the dead sentry, nude as the first had been, I closed my eyes for a moment, and when I opened them again there was no seaweed, no monstrous shape, upon the promenade. But even from where I stood I could see the wet footprints, and wondered whom the next creature of the deep would claim from aboard our ill-fated vessel. Resolutely I drew my pistol and returned once more toward the stern of the vessel. This creature of the depths, whatever it was, had taken life, twice. Whatever it was mortal, and whatever is mortal, a bullet will slay. But in the very act of whirling, I stopped short, for between me and the stern of the vessel, smiling dreamily, water rippling over her nude and glorious body to splash upon the deck, stood the creature who had come up from the depths in the wake of the ship, bearing the dead man in her arms. My arm fell to my side, my weapon clattered to the deck, and as I moved forward once more, slowly, a step at a time, as the sentry had done, the wondrous creature held out her dripping arms, and my eyes drank in all the glorious wonder of her, from head to... But she had no feet, where the feet should have been, and the legs. There were neither legs nor feet, but a scaly column, wet and dripping like a serpent with a woman's body. I screamed in terror and unbelief, but it was too late, and her arms were about me, preventing all escape. But with the touch of those arms, I did not wish to struggle. I knew what had happened to the 2 sentries, knew the same was in prospect for me. Yet at the moment, there seemed nothing in all the world more worthwhile than to slip over the side into the depths with the arms of this wondrous creature about me. "Lieutenant! Lieutenant! For the love of God, what is happening to you?" It was the voice of the sergeant of the guard, freighted with abysmal terror. But I did not care. The shapely, strangely warm arms of the sea creature were about me, and the sound of the bells, unbelievably sweet now, was in my ears. For me, the world had ceased to exist, save for the knowledge that these 2 things were true. I was carried to the rail, and went over slowly without commotion, as comfortably as though I had been riding on a couch of eiderdown, and came to myself, to know myself lost indeed. I was deep down, whirling over and over behind the whirling screws of the ship, holding my breath until my lungs were nigh to bursting, swimming with all my might, striving to reach the surface and life-giving air, when I hadn't the slightest idea which way was upward. With all my power, I fought toward the surface, but my progress was slow and dragging, for there was a weight about my knees, as though arms were clasped about them, striving to hold me down. A wordless voice was in my ears, begging, beseeching, and there was something in the voice which made my struggles seem foolish and unnecessary, so that I desired never to reach the air I needed. I closed my eyes, which I had opened instinctively upon striking the water, and 2 lips pressed firmly against my own, and those lips saved my life and my reason, for they were the cold lips of a corpse, with neither love nor challenge in them. I flailed out once more, and my hand caught in the line which the steamer dragged over her stern to measure the knots she traveled. All about me, as I was hurled forward, now underwater, now with nostrils out for a brief breathing space, the mass of seaweed rose and fell on the heavy seas. God knows how I ever got back aboard the troop ship, but I awoke at mess call in the morning, and sent immediately for the sergeant of the guard. "What happened after I came back aboard last night, Sergeant?" I asked abruptly. The sergeant of the guard stared at me as though he thought me insane. "I don't understand you," he managed finally. "Have we finally passed through the area of seaweed?" "Seaweed? Is the lieutenant making sport of me? We're 2,000 miles from any land, save the ocean bottom, and there ain't any seaweed anywhere. I don't understand you." "Let it pass," I said. "When did you last visit the sentries last night?" "Just before midnight, sir." "And were all of them at their post of duty?" "Yes, sir." "And what about the bells?" Again the sergeant's puzzlement was so genuine that I knew he did not understand my meaning. How much of my experience had been real? How much fantasy? I tried another tack. "Did you make a round of the sentries after midnight?" The sergeant shook his head sheepishly. "It is one of the rules of guard duty that one visit to all sentries must take place between midnight and morning." "Then the guard hasn't been mustered this morning. Is everyone present? You don't know?" Then go at once and find out. 10 minutes later, the sergeant returned, chalk white of face, to report that 2 of the guard were missing and could not be found anywhere aboard. He told me their names, and instantly my mind went back to the night of uncanny happenings just past, and the 2 nude bodies brought back from the deep in the arms of whom or what? I never knew, and to this day the questions I have propounded have never been answered. But this I know, there are strange things and sounds in the sea near the 180th meridian, 1,000 miles north of Honolulu, and this is the strangest incident in my night of terror. The clothing which I donned next morning was entirely dry, but my hair was stiff with salt water, and there was the tang of seaweed in my room when I awoke. I looked too at the glass which covered the porthole beside my bed. Outside that glass were the smudged prints of thin lips, the blur above them which told of a face pressed against the glass from outside, as though somebody or something had tried to peer in between nightfall and morning. And the bells? I still can hear them in memory, when sometimes I waken at sea after midnight, and the rolling and plunging of the ship tell me that a storm is making.
The Other Lodgers by Ambrose Bierce. In order to take that train, said Colonel Levering, sitting in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, you will have to remain nearly all night in Atlanta. That is a fine city, but I advise you not to put up at the Breathed House, one of the principal hotels. It is an old wooden building in urgent need of repairs. There are breaches in the walls that you could throw a cat through. The bedrooms have no locks on the doors, no furniture but a single chair in each, and a bedstead without bedding. Just a mattress. Even these meager accommodations you cannot be sure that you will have in Monopoly. You must take your chance of being stowed in with a lot of others. Sir, it is a most abominable hotel. The night that I passed in it was an uncomfortable night. I got in late and was shown to my room on the ground floor by an apologetic night clerk with a tallow candle, which he considerately left with me. I was worn out by 2 days and a night of hard railway travel, and had not entirely recovered from a gunshot wound in the head, received in an altercation. Rather than look for better quarters, I lay down on the mattress without removing my clothing and fell asleep. Along toward morning, I woke. The moon had risen and was shining in at the uncurtained window, illuminating the room with a soft bluish light which seemed somehow a bit spooky, though I dare say it had no uncommon quality. All moonlight is that way if you will observe it. Imagine my surprise and indignation when I saw the floor occupied by at least a dozen other lodgers. I sat up, earnestly damning the management of that unthinkable hotel, and was about to spring from the bed to go and make trouble for the night clerk, him of the apologetic manner and the tallow candle, when something in the situation affected me with a strange indisposition to move. I suppose that was what a story writer might call frozen with terror, for those men were obviously all dead. They lay on their backs, disposed orderly along 3 sides of the room, their feet to the walls. Against the other wall, farthest from the door, stood my bed and the chair. All the faces were covered, but under their white cloths, the features of the 2 bodies that lay in the square patch of moonlight near the window showed in sharp profile as to nose and chin. I thought this a bad dream, and tried to cry out as one does in a nightmare, but could make no sound. At last, with a desperate effort, I threw my feet to the floor, and passing between the 2 rows of clouded faces and the 2 bodies that lay nearest the door, I escaped from the infernal place and ran to the office. The night clerk was there, behind the desk, sitting in the dim light of another tallow candle. Just sitting and staring. He did not rise. My abrupt entrance produced no effect upon him, though I must have looked a veritable corpse myself. It occurred to me then that I had not before really observed the fellow. He was a little chap with a colorless face and the whitest, blankest eyes I ever saw. He had no more expression than the back of my hand. His clothing was a dirty gray. "Damn you," I said. "What do you mean?" Just the same, I was shaking like a leaf in the wind and did not recognize my own voice. The night clerk rose, bowed apologetically, and, well, he was no longer there, and at that moment I felt a hand laid upon my shoulder from behind. Just fancy that if you can. Unspeakably frightened, I turned and saw a portly, kind-faced gentleman who asked,
What is the matter, my friend?
I was not long in telling him, but before I made an end of it, he went pale himself.
See here,
He said.
are you telling the truth?
I had now gotten myself in hand, and terror had given place to indignation. "If you dare to doubt it," I said, "I'll hammer the life out of you."
No, he replied. Don't do that. Just sit down till I tell you. This is not a hotel. It used to be. Afterward, it was a hospital. Now, it is unoccupied, awaiting a tenant. The room that you mentioned was the dead room. There were always plenty of dead. The fellow that you call the night clerk used to be that, but later he booked the patients as they were brought in. I don't understand his being here. He has been dead a few weeks.
"And who are you?" I blurted out.
Oh, I look after the premises. I happened to be passing just now, and seeing a light in here came in to investigate. Let us have a look into that room.
He added, lifting the sputtering candle from the desk. "I'll see you at the devil first," said I, bolting out of the door into the street. "Sir, that breathing house in Atlanta is a beastly place. Don't you stop there."
God forbid. Your account of it certainly doesn't suggest comfort. By the way, Colonel, when did all that occur?
In September 1864, shortly after the siege. End of The Other Lodgers by Ambrose Bierce.